2 Kings, the second chapter. And in this chapter we have the last episode in the life of the prophet Elijah as he turned his ministry over to the young Elisha. And you'll recall that they started from Gilgal there in the first verse of the second chapter. And then Elijah was called to 3 other geographical points, or that is to say, first to Bethel, and then to Jericho, and then to the Jordan. And in each case, he suggested that Elisha should stay behind. And in each case, Elisha said that no, he'd go too. And then we come across at these various geographical places, we come across a group of people known as the sons of the prophets. And as we notice the story here, they were free with their information, but they didn't have anything that Elisha didn't already know. And they'd say, Elisha, we want to give you some advice. We want to tell you we're prophets now, and we want to do a little prophesying, tell you what's going to happen. And Elisha so much as said, well, you needn't have bothered because I already knew that. And so we're going to find out more about these fellows that are called the sons of the prophets because they're going to crop up quite frequently here. But the journey ended at the Jordan River, and you'll remember how Elijah struck the Jordan River with his mantle, and the waters parted. And then he was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind as there appeared a chariot of fire. And his mantle fell on Elisha, and Elisha picked it up and struck it on the Jordan River. He had asked for a double portion of the power that Elijah had, and the river opened up. And he walked across and came to the city of Jericho. And beginning with the 15th verse of the second chapter of 2 Kings, we have this strange story about the city of Jericho. And as we were reading and discussing this, we discovered that there are many stories in the Bible about Jericho. And we pointed out that it was somewhat difficult to understand Jericho until you first understood the significance of the River Jordan and also the significance of a place called Gilgal. Now, as Elisha ministered, his ministry carried him to these geographical points in inverse order. That is to say, he started out from Gilgal and went to Bethel, to Jericho, to Jordan. We're going to see that as he starts out on his ministry, he's going to go from Jordan to Jericho through Bethel, and then later on we'll find him at Gilgal, and he has a ministry at each of these places. So we conclude that when Elijah was taking him on this first journey down towards the Jordan River, that Elijah was giving him insight on what a ministry, an effective ministry for the Lord, really entails. It was kind of like counting the cost. Now, Elisha, I don't want you to get involved in this until you count the cost. Well, Elisha had already counted the cost, remember, although he was from a very wealthy family, and he had charge of his father's operation of farming with 12 yoke of oxen, and we found him right out in the middle of the field with the 12th yoke, and he left all of this and sacrificed unto God, and he had already counted the cost. But this was a second effort on the part of Elijah to make sure that Elisha was counting the cost. Now, in order to get the significance of this Gilgal, the place from which they left there in 2 Kings, the second chapter, those of you who were not here last week, we went back to the book of Joshua in the early chapters to find out just what the significance of Gilgal was. So before we continue with our story here in 2 Kings, we should turn again to Joshua, and we'll pick up the significance of Gilgal again, and then we'll go on to Jericho and see why it's so necessary to go to Gilgal first. You notice in Joshua chapter 5 or chapter 4, Joshua chapter 4, in the 19th verse, "And the people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month and encamped in Gilgal in the east border of Jericho. And those 12 stones which they took out of the Jordan did Joshua set up or pitch in Gilgal." And then again in the 5th chapter, the 9th verse, "And the Lord said unto Joshua, This day have I rolled away the reproach of Egypt from off you. Wherefore the name of the place is called Gilgal unto this day, and the children of Israel encamped in Gilgal, and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at evening in the plains of Jericho." Well, we pointed out, when God mentions a place this many times in this short a space, it has some special significance. And we recounted the things that happened at Gilgal. Number one, the 12 stones were set up there from out of the depths of the River Jordan as a memorial. And this stands for life out of death, or the resurrection. It represents the resurrection. The Jordan River representing that current which takes us down into the Dead Sea, or the end of life, and as is pictured by the Dead Sea. Jordan really stands for our life without Christ, which God calls death. I know you'll hear some of the commentaries that say the Jordan River stands for death, and this is not, there's nothing wrong with that. It does stand for the death and resurrection of Christ, and it stands for the death of the human being. It stands for his life, really. But God says you were dead in trespasses and sin, and whatever your life is going to end up being, God calls it that. And to cross the River Jordan at flood stage is to make a decision that you want to count your life as over and live in newness of life unto God. And that's what these stones represent. Exactly the same thing as water baptism represents. Death to your old life and a new life in Christ. Dying to self and walking in newness of life. Or, as Paul put it in Galatians 2:20, "I am crucified," or "I have been crucified with Christ. Nevertheless I live. Yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." So to cross over Jordan is to count yourself dead to self. Give up your own aspirations and so forth, and live for God. And before you go to Jericho, and we'll soon see the significance, you must cross over Jordan. And here's the significance, too, of course, of Elisha crossing over Jordan. He was showing forth that which he'd already decided before when he left the oxen. He was showing that he counted himself to be dead, and everything from there on, from the moment he came up out of Jordan, his life was in the hands of his God. Day by day, moment by moment. It was life out of death. Paul could say, to live is Christ and to die is gain. Or you can turn that around, and you can say, to die is gain, and to live is Christ. That is, to count yourself as dead, really is a position whereby you can really earn eternal rewards, because you thereby become alive unto Christ. So Gilgal is the place where the stones were set up, the stones out of death unto life. It stands for the resurrection. And as soon as you come out of the Jordan, the next thing is to go to Gilgal, there, the place of resurrection. And then we found out that Gilgal is by Jericho. And as we go on here, we'll see the significance of this. Gilgal is right next to Jericho. Then we found out that Gilgal was the place where the children of Israel were circumcised, which means they set themselves apart for God. They recognized a special relationship with their God, saying, I hereby dedicate my whole being and all my progeny and whatever I'll ever be, I dedicate to my God. This is the significance of the circumcision. And then we found after they were circumcised, they ceased to eat the manna, and from then on they ate the old corn of the land. And we pointed out Gilgal is the place where you start eating of the old corn of the land. Now, if you take the figure all the way through here, you'll see that manna stands for glorying in or feasting upon that which Jesus Christ did for you historically in his past ministry, in his life, death, and resurrection. He explains this very carefully for you in the 6th chapter of John. It represents the Christ that came down. And yet he says in that same chapter, he says, you think this is something. What if you see the Christ, what if you see the Son of Man going up again from where he came down? And to glory in what Jesus Christ is doing in his resurrection ministry is to feast upon the old corn of the land. Or you're being sustained spiritually, that is, not so much by what Jesus Christ did for you in the past, but what he will do in you, through you, and for you in his current ministry, in his resurrection ministry. So Gilgal, first, is the place where you begin your walk in newness of life. Gilgal is the place where you dedicate your whole being and all that's yours to God. And Gilgal is the place where you become usable by God and you're sustained not so much by what God did for you or Christ did for you, but what he does in and through you. And then we find also Gilgal is the place where you come face to face with the captain of the Lord of hosts. We found that also in the 5th chapter. That is to say, the time when you realize that the risen Christ is not somebody who helps you fight your battles. No, he fights the battles. And it's the place where you recognize that he's not for you or against you. Remember, Joshua said, are you for us or against us? He said, neither one. He is, in our battles in this world, Christ is not for us and he is not against us. In other words, he is not joining into the battle, neither is he opposing a battle. He is the captain, the Lord of the host. The battle is his, and he simply invites us to go along and share in the victory. But the battle is his. So there's a real sense in which he doesn't help us fight our battle. No, the battle is his. He's the captain, the Lord of hosts. And he said, Joshua, take off your feet, or take off your shoes, because you're standing on holy ground. And Joshua fell down on his face and worshiped. And Gilgal is also the place where you take off your shoes and recognize that you're on holy ground if you're going to be a part of what God is doing. Now, all of this is at Gilgal. At Gilgal, then, you start your walk. You come to Gilgal to start your walk in the resurrection life, and to be reminded constantly of the resurrection, or life out of death. It's a life here on earth out of death. It's not so much that resurrection that's going to happen to you someday. It's that resurrection of which you can be a part here and now. Like Paul said, oh, that I might know him and the power of his resurrection. Paul wasn't talking about something that would happen to him after his physical death, but he was talking about living this life as though you had already been resurrected and was living in the same power as you would as a resurrected being. And this is what you get from Gilgal. Now, we pointed out that you only cross Jordan once, spiritually, but you go to Gilgal every day, or every time you're going to launch out upon anything from the Lord. In other words, only once in your life do you need to make the decision, God, I agree that to count my life as nothing, and that all the rest of life, the rest of my river that's to run from this point on down into the Dead Sea, or from this point until I would have died anyway, I count all of this just to be dedicated to you. That's a one-time decision. You cross over Jordan at flood stage only once. And Christ goes before you, we found out, because you've not been that way before, the phraseology says. But you go to Gilgal day by day, and you mustn't attempt to be a part of what God is doing except you go regularly to Gilgal. That's where you pick up the command of the Lord of hosts, of the captain of hosts. Now, we spent quite a lot of time here in review, and we went into all of this that we've just discussed in quite detail last week, and so we're not trying to pass over it, but for those of we have quite a few here, I see, that weren't here last week, and this is the reason we're spending as much time as we have in review, because now we've got to go to Jericho, and you must never go to Jericho until you've crossed Jordan and been to Gilgal, or you won't make it. It won't work. Well, what does Jericho stand for? Jericho stands for the world. And you might say, well, I thought Egypt stands for the world. Well, Egypt stands for the world as it allures you and enslaves you. And you were already saved out of Egypt when you crossed the Red Sea. See, you crossed the Red Sea out of Egypt, but you crossed Jordan to face Jericho. Egypt stands for the world as we have it in Ephesians chapter 2. Before you were saved, the Bible says you walked according to the course of this world. But Jericho is the world that you have in 1 John. Love not the world nor the things of the world. Or as you have it in the Gospel of John, Jesus says, I've overcome the world. Or the world in its bad ethnic sense, as it would tend to keep you from doing what God has for you. Keep you from being involved in His work after you've crossed over the River Jordan. So Jericho stands for the world that you encounter after you're saved. As a matter of fact, it's not the world just after you were saved, but it's the world after you are not only saved, but you've decided to walk in the newness of life. You've crossed over Jordan. It's the world as it would hinder you from possessing the land, so to speak. And Jericho is a walled city just as soon as you enter the Holy Land. And notice the children of Israel didn't try to knock down the walls of Jericho until they'd been to Gilgal. And you mustn't try that. That is to say, you mustn't attempt to tackle the fortress of this world and all of its systems until you go to Jericho. Until you go to Gilgal regularly. Now, we haven't plumbed the depths of the truth, God's truth about Gilgal to any means. We're going to find a story about Gilgal involving the ministry of Elisha as we go along. And we'll get more involved with Gilgal then, because there are many, many Bible stories that happened at Gilgal. As a matter of fact, if you go back and read the books of Joshua and Judges, you'll find that when they had the real success, they started at Gilgal each time. And when they got defeated, they didn't start from Gilgal. They didn't have the right relationship. So don't you go on any battles till you go to Gilgal. And if you don't understand what that means, well, look up Gilgal in your concordance and read the scriptures very carefully and ask the Holy Spirit to open up those scriptures for you. But after you've been to Gilgal, then you can go to Jericho. And the walls will come tumbling down. And we found out why last week is because the place was shut up, and they were afraid of God. Look at chapter 6 of Joshua again. Now Jericho was straitly shut up because the children of Israel, none went out and none came in. Now why did it shut itself all up? It was a fortified city, and the men were men of war, but they were fearful. Notice what one of the inhabitants said back in the 2nd chapter. Joshua chapter 2, verse 9. And she said unto the men, I know that the Lord hath given you the land, and that your terror is fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land faint because of you. And in verse 24 of the second chapter, and they said unto Joshua, truly the Lord hath delivered into our hands all the land, for even all the inhabitants of the country do faint because of us. Christ has already overcome Jericho. The world is already defeated. All you need to do is enter into that victory. And the story of that, of course, is in the 6th chapter of Joshua. But here in the book of Joshua, we have 3 definite stories concerning Jericho and a prophecy concerning Jericho. And we need to explore these some. We'll not have time to read them because we just don't have that much time available. But I'll tell you where they are, and I'll give you the gist of it, and then you read it yourself. For instance, in the 2nd chapter, we have the story of Rahab the harlot, who was the only one, along with her family, saved out of Jericho. And whether you like it or not, Rahab the harlot represents you. Because, you see, you were in this world, and all your righteousness was as filthy rags. In God's sight, you were just as sinful as the harlot Rahab. But she had faith, and she believed God, and God saved her and her household. And she became the ancestress of the Lord Jesus Christ. And if you read the genealogy of Christ in Matthew chapter 1, you'll find out that she married an Israelite later on after this, and of that marriage came the lineage on down through David, King David, and on down to Joseph and Mary. Both Joseph and Mary were descendants of Rahab. And so Christ, through his legal, you might say, lineage, and through his natural lineage, he was descended from Rahab the harlot. And this is to show us God's grace, that no matter the lowest person in Jericho, the very lowest person in this world, can avail themselves of that which is God, that which God provides. And so you should take great glory in the fact that even Rahab was saved, and Rahab was utilized by God to bring in the very Savior of the world. Now, we wouldn't have done it that way at all, I'll assure you. As a matter of fact, we don't like it too well because God did it that way. But he did it that way anyway. And if you really search out the reason why God did it that way, you'll appreciate your salvation even more. And you'll appreciate the lowliness by which Christ was willing to come to us. But Rahab believed. And if you read in the 11th chapter of Hebrews, she has her place among the great stalwarts of faith. That's called God's Hall of Fame, you know. In the 11th chapter of Hebrews, you'll find Rahab right there. She has honorable mention, you might say, in the Hall of Faith. So that's the first story, that the lowliest among the those that are in Jericho, anybody in Jericho could have been saved if they really wanted to be. If they would really have placed their trust in God, God would have saved them. Then the next story we have of Jericho came along right after the encounter at Gilgal, and this starts in the 6th chapter, and this, of course, is the very familiar story of the fall of Jericho. And let's just notice a few things. We've read the first verse, Joshua 6:2, and the Lord said unto Joshua, See, I have given into thine hand Jericho and its king and its mighty men of valor. Notice the tense there. God says, I have given. Well, he hadn't yet, but when God says he'll do something, he can put it in the past tense because it's sure to be done. It's just that sure. It makes it more emphatic. And ye shall compass the city, all ye men of war, and go round about the city once. Thou shalt do 6 days, and 7 priests shall bear before the ark 7 trumpets of ram's horn, and the 7th day ye shall compass the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow with the trumpet, and it shall come to pass that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when ye hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city shall fall down flat, and the people shall send up every man straight before him. Then that's exactly what happened as you read the story. Now, notice the emphasis here in the 5th verse on all the people. God will involve, or does involve, everyone who crosses over Jordan, everyone who goes to Gilgal. He wants them involved in what he's doing. And he has a position for the very lowest. And notice the Ark of the Covenant went before them. This stands for the presence of Christ. And Christ goes before us. Before he puts out his sheep, he goeth before them. But he wants to involve all the people. Now the problem is, when we want to do something, we want to pick and choose which of God's people we involve. And that's what they did when they wanted to capture another city. Notice they had the next city after Jericho was a little town named Ai. And notice what they had to say in the 7th chapter, the 3rd verse. And they returned to Joshua and said unto him, Let not all the people go up, but let about 2,000 or 3,000 men go up and smite Ai, and make not all the people labor, for there are but few. In other words, this is an easy battle, and we don't need everybody like we did in Jericho. Well, they really got beat. And the reason they got beat was for 2 reasons. Reason number 1, they didn't go to Gilgal. They didn't start out from Gilgal. And reason number 2, they thought that they could do a little bit in their own strength, when Christ says, without me you can do nothing. And you can do all things through Christ, who strengtheneth you. So they made the fatal error of believing that they could do some of God's work in their own strength. And they didn't need all of God's heavenly forces. But God uses every saint of his that will deign to cross Jordan and go to Jericho or go to Gilgal. He involves them all in the defeat at Jericho. Now notice in the 6th chapter again, the 19th verse, he says, well, let's start with the 17th verse. Joshua 6:17, and the city, that is Jericho, shall be accursed, even it, and all that are in it, to the Lord. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all who are with her in the house, because she hid the messengers that we sent. And ye, in any wise, keep yourself from the accursed thing, lest ye make yourself accursed, when ye take the accursed thing, and make the camp of Israel a curse, and trouble it. But all the silver, and gold, and vessels of brass, and iron, are consecrated unto the Lord. They shall come into the treasury of the Lord. Now you'd have to understand why God said this. You see, everything useful in the world must be dedicated to God, or God can't use it. Now, he uses material things to do his work in the world. But it must all be dedicated to him first. And the accursed thing is to take that which God has entrusted to you, and you go out and do God's work with it. Or use God's provision, or use your material wealth, or your material possessions, or stewardship in this world for your own aggrandizement. You see, God doesn't fuss about how you consume your possessions on your own self, as long as you stay the other side of Jordan, as long as you're content to be a wilderness Christian. He makes no real claim. But don't go over Jordan and claim to be dead to self and walk in newness of life, and then covet your possessions and your position in this world. Because that's what crossing over Jordan is doing. It's saying, God, I count myself not to own anything. Don't cross over Jordan and be a tither, whatever you do. I guess tithing's all right for the other side of Jordan. But when you cross over Jordan, you don't owe a tenth to God. You don't owe him a thing, or you owe him all. And everything of a material nature is in your possession, everything is in your possession or custody for his use. Now, he doesn't ask any Christian to cross over Jordan. Crossing over Jordan is not how to get to heaven. You apply the blood of the Lamb. And you apply the blood of the Lamb, and then you stand still, and God takes you across the Red Sea, out of Egypt. Now, that's how you get saved. If you're not understanding the figurative language, it's because you haven't been to some of our previous Bible studies. But you'll remember there the stories in the book of Exodus, the 14th, 12th through the 14th, or 12th through the 15th chapters of Exodus, the way God saved his people out of the grasp of Egypt, or out of slavery. This is a picture of your being saved out of sin. You take the blood of the sacrificial lamb and apply it to the doorpost. That's to recognize what Christ did on Calvary's cross as your salvation. You do that by faith. You apply the blood of the lamb. Then you stand still and you watch God take you right out of Egypt, and he does it by bringing you across the Red Sea. You cross the Red Sea to get out of Egypt. You cross the Red Sea in order to be saved. You cross over Jordan because you want to be actively involved in what God is doing, and God doesn't require you to cross over Jordan in order to get to heaven. You stay right over in the wilderness if you want to. But if you go across Jordan and you essay to live in newness of life unto God, if you say, yes, I want to count myself as dead, then count yourself as dead. And don't take the things of this world to promote yourself, but utilize whatever God places in your custody just for what he's doing in the world. Now, that's very important. If you don't understand the importance of that, then you go back and carefully read Deuteronomy chapter 11 and 12, particularly chapter 12, when it says, over Jordan there's two mountains. There's Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. There's a mount of curse and the mount of blessing. And he says, well, you can worship any way you want to before you go across Jordan. But when you go across Jordan, you worship in spirit and in truth. You find out what God is interested in. And because if you claim to count yourself as dead, and then you hang on to the things of life, the land of promise will become a land of curse instead of a land of blessing. That doesn't mean you'll end up in hell. It just means that you've been better off to stay the other side of Jordan. And so don't decide that you're going to live all out for the Lord. I shudder every time. I tell you, in these churches where they have all the young people on the slightest occasion all come and dedicate their lives to the Lord and promise all this to God and make all of these vows, I sit back in my seat and I shudder. And I say, don't do that to those young people without causing them to understand what they're doing. You take them like Elijah did. You take them from Gilgal, and you take them and let them count the cost, and you make sure they understand into what they're being involved. And let's not make any of these flippant dedications. Don't cross over Jordan unless you want to live all out for your God. It's a serious thing. Now, we got a story here about a man that decided not to dedicate all the silver and the gold and the vessels of bronze, the iron that were to be consecrated unto the Lord. This is only if you cross over Jordan. If you stayed out in the wilderness, God graciously invites you to take whatever you want to of your gold and silver and help build the tabernacle so that there will be an access to God. That is to say, you have a way of approach to God, and you hang on to your own little trinkets and give God what little measure of them you want to. That's for the east side of Jordan. That's for the wilderness side of Jordan. But over across Jordan, you're dead to self. See, Ananias and Sapphira did that in Acts chapter 15. They said they were crossing over Jordan, and then they kept back part of what they had. And that's the reason God had to take them right out of this world. Now, if you think God was harsh with Sapphira and Ananias, well, you just think about this. When you get to heaven, they'll be there. Don't worry about that. He's not a mean God. And he wasn't sentencing them to hell. And you don't go to hell because you don't do right on the other side of Jordan. You go to hell because you don't apply the blood of the Lamb so that you can be saved out of Egypt. Oh, I trust that we can get the differentiation between the two situations. So what happened about this fella and his trinkets. Notice again that 19th verse of the 6th chapter. And then I want you to notice another thing. The 26th verse of the 6th chapter. And Joshua charged them at the time, saying, Cursed be the man before the Lord who riseth up and buildeth this city Jericho. He shall lay the foundations of it, and his firstborn and in his youngest son shall set up the gates of it. God says, I'm going to tear down Jericho for you, and I'm going to involve you in it. See to it that you don't ever build it up again. When you get in the promised land, you're never to build Jericho back up again. You're not to build the world up as a fortress so that your fellow Christian can stumble thereby. You're not to hold the things of the world out to allure your fellow Christian by. And when what this verse means is, if any man physically ever built Jericho, that while he was building the foundations, his oldest son would die, and while he was setting up the gates or finishing the city, his youngest son would die. If anybody ever tried. Well, now we know that Jericho, it was rebuilt after this because we've already seen it in 2 Kings, haven't we? And the story of it being rebuilt is in the last verse of 1 Kings 16. As the fellow decided that Jericho needed to be rebuilt, and he rebuilt it, and what happened to him, just what God said would happen to him. He lost both his sons. His oldest son died when he was laying the foundation. His youngest son died when he was finishing the city or setting up the gates of it. So Jericho was rebuilt. Now in the 7th chapter, we have this story of the defeat at the little town of Ai, and we find that somebody did wrong. God said in the 11th verse of the 7th chapter of Joshua, Israel hath sinned, and they have also transgressed my covenant which I commanded them, for they have even taken of the accursed thing, and have also stolen, and disassembled also, and have put it among their own stuff. Now here's the problem. Taking things that have been blessed of God and putting it among your own stuff, or calling it yours, you know. God said this is consecrated to him, but I put it among my own stuff. I say, well, God must have wanted me to use it, and so I'll go live it up. And they found out that there's just one guy that did this, a fellow named Achan. 19th verse of the 7th chapter. And Joshua said unto Achan, My son, give, I pray thee, glory to the Lord God of Israel, and make confession unto him, and tell me now what thou hast done, and hide it not from me. And Achan answered Joshua and said, Indeed I have sinned against the Lord God of Israel, and thus have I done. And when I saw among the spoils a goodly Babylonish garment, and 200 shekels of silver, and a wedge of gold of 50 shekels of weight, and I coveted them, and took them, and beheld, they are hidden in the earth in the midst of my tent, and the silver under it. Now notice in the first verse, he says, I saw, and then later on, I coveted, and I took. This is what happened to everybody that gets drawn down this road. What happened here is what James warns us against in the 1st chapter. He says, God tempteth no man, neither can God be tempted by any man, but every man is tempted when he's drawn away by his own lust. And lust, when it has conceived, bringeth forth, or lust, when it is conceived, bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. That's James chapter 1, I believe, verses 13 through 17, about in there. This is the same thing that happened to Eve. She saw, she coveted, and she took. Same thing that happened to David when he sinned. He saw, he coveted, and he took. Same thing that happened to Samson. He saw, he coveted, and he took. So this is the way it works. The lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. Now what was this that he took? First he took a Babylonish garment. This is another way of saying that he was more interested in something else than he was pleasing God. This is idolatry. Babylon always stands for idolatry, and a goodly Babylonish garment is something that pleases you, that takes your affections away from God. It could be a false religion, for instance. That's a Babylonish garment, because I'll tell you the best example I know of. You hear it said so frequently. On Sunday, go to the church or the synagogue of your choice. That's selecting a Babylonish garment. And it has no place on the other side of Jordan. You don't try to find the speaker that tickles your ears or the place that just suits your fancy. This is Babylon, straight out of Babylon. You worship like you please. When God says, they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth, for God seeketh such to worship him. Not somebody that's bent on finding the particular church situation that satisfies their own desires. This is a Babylonish garment. So he took a Babylonish garment. He took 2 shekels of silver. Now the silver stands for redemption, and that belongs to God. And taking shekels of silver is you're doing God's work, his redemptive work your way, or without any regard to it. It's to put a stumbling block in the redemptive program. And a wedge of gold, 50 shekels of weight. And this is to operate in such a manner that God's glory is not shown forth. Gold stands for divinity and deity and manifestation. And then notice he also took let's see. There was involved also brass and iron. Doesn't say that he took those, but back in the 619, the brass stands for judgment, which is God. Taking brass when you ought not to is to violate God when he says, "Judge not your brother." It's setting yourself up to do God's work in judging. And taking of iron is to claim that you have strength. Iron stands for strength in the Bible. And when you take iron, you do just what they did at Ai. You say, well, I got a little strength. I can do some things. Christ says you can do nothing without me. So to take a Babylonish garment is to have a higher regard for something than you have for God. To take silver is to interfere with God's redemptive program. To take gold is keep his glory from being manifested. To take brass is to set yourself up as judging God's servants. And to take iron is to think you've got some strength in yourself. And God says when you're in this world, you turn all that over to him, every bit of it. Notice, it says something strange here about the silver. He says that all of these things are hidden in the earth, in the midst of my tent, and the silver under it. He lost his witness. He couldn't lead a soul to Christ because he lost his ability to be used by God. Now, all these people he and all his family were stoned to death. You say, well, how horrible. Well, parents, I'll tell you, when you decide to covet the things of this world, you're not influencing just yourself, but you're taking your whole family right down that wrong road. You're showing them the wrong thing. Don't set any Babylonish garments in front of your children and utilize them. You say, what does this mean from a practical standpoint? From a practical standpoint, it simply means that whatever wealth or material goods God is pleased to put in my custody, I count it as available for his use. And I always think in terms of, can God use this? Or will it help my operation in God's work? And how can I best utilize it so God's work gets done? This is what it means. So we have these stories in I took off my watch because it was scratching my arm, and now I've set it aside somewhere and don't know where to put it. So I might run overtime. That would be awful, wouldn't it? Oh, here it is. Yeah, I've got the little deal on the side of the watch there is dug into my skin, and it hurts to keep it on, so I took it off. Well, how about some of these other stories on Jericho? Well, let's go over some of them quickly. Let's go to this story of Jericho in 2 Kings. Now that we know that we go to Gilgal first, Second Kings chapter 2, chapter 3. Still in chapter 2, aren't we? 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 15. And when the sons of the prophet, who were just sort of looking on at Jericho, saw him, they said, the spirit of Elijah doth rest on Elisha. Now, we pointed out that these sons of the prophets are those who claim to be God's spokesmen. And we want to notice that they had settled down in Jericho. They had made Jericho their home. And they recognized that the Spirit of God was on Elisha, and they had recognized that the Spirit of God was on Elijah. But they sure didn't understand much about their God. And they came to meet him and bowed themselves to the ground before him. They didn't even know any better than to worship a man. And they said unto him, Behold, now there are with thy servants 50 strong men. Let them go, we pray thee, and seek thy master, lest peradventure the Spirit of the Lord hath taken him up and cast him upon some mountain or into some valley. And he said, Ye shall not sin. And when they urged him till he was ashamed, he said, Sin. They sent therefore 50 men, and they sought 3 days, but found him not. Now, I don't know to what extent I covered this last week, but quite a few of you weren't here, so I'll go over it just briefly. Notice that these sons of the prophets were settled down in Jericho, and notice that Elisha was there, but he was just passing through. Now, for someone who has been to Gilgal, and someone who is living the abundant Christian life and the resurrected life, he goes through Jericho many times. We're going to see this. But you never settle down there. You go there as a ministry. That is to say, you're in the world, but not of the world. It's as though, now Christ explains this very carefully in his high priestly prayer in the 17th chapter of John. He says, I have saved them out of the world. And then he says, I have sent them into the world, that the world might know that the Father had sent me. So it's just as though, if you crossed over Jordan, it's just as though God had taken, you died, you see, and you went out of this world. Because you're not of this world, then God, as soon as you get to heaven, he turns right around and sends you back into the world on a mission. So it's all right to go to Jericho, but you don't settle down in Jericho. Your ministry is in Jericho. But you better spend some time at Gilgal, and as we're going to see later, on Mount Carmel, and some other places. And don't hang around Jericho too much, or Jericho might trap you. And that's what had happened to these sons of the prophets. They'd settled down in Jericho. And notice they were so devoid of spiritual perception that they thought that God had taken Elijah and smashed him up against the mountain somewhere. And they decided they better go hunting. So they said, Elisha, we want to give your spiritual leader Elijah a good, decent funeral, so we'll send some people to go find him. And when they find him, well, we'll bury him and give him a proper burial. And Elisha says, well, don't send them in, find Elijah. And they kept begging him, said, well, all right, if you insist on it, go ahead and send them. And they came back and said, well, we couldn't find him. And he says, oh. See, these sons of the prophets are always informing Elisha about something. They're always giving him some instructions, and he already knew it. And that's the way with the sons of the prophets. They've got plenty of information for you. That's these spokesmen for God that have settled down in the world, but no spiritual perception. And they're willing to give you advice, but they can't tell you anything you don't know. You already know more than they do, but they got lots to say. Now notice, the people that lived in Jericho had a problem. In the 18th verse, and when they came again to him, for he tarried at Jericho, that means he stayed there to wait for him, he said unto them, Did I not say unto you not to go, that is, no, go and try to find the body of Elijah? 19th verse, and the men of the city said unto Elisha. Now these are just probably the officials, the mayor and the city council and so forth, the people in charge of Jericho, said to Elijah, Behold, I pray thee, the situation of this city is pleasant, as the Lord seeth, but the water is naught or bad, and the ground barren. They're saying, look, this is a terrific place to live. It's a very pleasant city, and it's nice, but there's only one problem. It says, the water's not any good. We have to go miles and miles away to get water, because the water here has all kind of minerals in it, and you can't drink it. And says the ground won't grow anything. Beautiful trees and everything, but just before the fruit gets ripe, it falls off. The ground won't bear good fruit. Now, notice that these sons of the prophets lived right there in town. They couldn't do a thing about it. But the men of the world didn't ask them to. They knew they didn't have any power. And the leaders of this world, the political leaders of this world, they know that the average religionist has no power from God. They kind of chuckle. They say, well, that's all right. The people like their religion, so they got to have some religious leaders, but these guys don't have any power with God. And they know that. As a matter of fact, if they ever decided to call upon somebody to pray for them, they wouldn't go to the recognized religious leaders. They'd try to think of somebody that they thought could get through to God. And so the sons of the prophets here, they didn't even understand God and how God worked. But this fellow did. These unsaved leaders of the world, they at least had enough perception to know that Elisha had some power with God. So they come to him with their trouble. They didn't go to the sons of the prophets. After all, hadn't they lived right in the city, and they didn't do any good so far. 20th verse. And he, that is Elisha, said, Bring me a new cruse and put salt in it. And they brought it to him, and he went forth unto the spring of water and cast the salt in there and said, Thus saith the Lord, I have healed these waters. There shall not be from thence any more death or barren land. So the waters were healed unto this day, according to the saying of Elisha, which he spoke. Now Elisha just went and he put some salt in the water, and it was fine. And then
We're sorry, but on the original tape, the remainder of this message was omitted.